When the world grows quiet and the noise of the present begins to fade, another voice can be heard, a low murmur that moves beneath the skin of time itself. Across the dark forests, along forgotten rivers, through the echoing ruins of palaces long crumbled, Europe still breathes through the ghosts of its vanished kings. Their names may have been erased from books, their crowns melted, their castles turned to dust, but their stories have never stopped whispering. Power, once bound by thrones and banners, has learned to hide within the veins of those who remain. Every continent has its legends, but Europe carries something different, a living memory that refuses to die. Behind revolutions and parliaments, behind democracies and wars, lies an invisible web of families who once shaped the world through lineage. Their blood flowed through empires and cathedrals, through knights and scholars, through saints and tyrants alike. When kingdoms fell, they endured through marriage, through disguise, through silence. The idea that power could be inherited through the body itself, through blood sanctified by time, remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Across the centuries, the thrones of Europe rose and fell like the tides. Rome's marble gave way to the stone of Frankish kings, to the gold of Byzantium, to the iron of the Vikings, to the velvet of Versailles. But beneath every empire, an older story continued, written not in ink, but in flesh. Long before the word dynasty existed, tribes and temples had already begun this eternal experiment, the shaping of destiny through blood. Each age merely added new symbols, new crowns, new names, but the same fire continued to burn beneath them all. History often speaks of power as if it were a weapon, but perhaps it is closer to a current, something that flows, transfers, and never truly stops. When monarchs were executed, their children vanished into the world, carrying fragments of the sacred flame within them. When palaces turned to ruins, their stones were built into new homes, their crests into new coats of arms. The past is not gone, it only changes its costume. To walk through Europe is to walk across the living map of continuity, to feel the pulse of dynasties beneath the streets of cities that believe themselves modern. This story is not about kings alone. It is about what power becomes when stripped of its throne, about the invisible inheritance that shapes nations long after coronations end. It is about the persistence of memory, of ritual, of identity woven through families whose roots stretch back beyond history's written line. From Celtic chieftains to Renaissance emperors, from the shadows of the Templars to the gilded courts of the Bourbons, these are the bloodlines that refuse to fade, the unseen architects of our world. If you feel drawn to such stories, those that merge mystery, history, and the quiet rhythm of legacy, then stay with this journey. Subscribe to the channel to hear more forgotten tales of ancient Europe, like the one you've just entered. Leave a like if this story captures your imagination, and share your thoughts below in the comments. Your support keeps these old whispers alive, so that the stories of shadowed crowns can continue to be heard in the silence of the night. Long before the clang of steel on castle walls, before banners rose above fields of conquest, the roots of Europe's royal lines were already burrowing deep into the earth. Power was not a crown of gold, but a fire passed from spirit to spirit, held sacred by families who ruled not from thrones, but from sacred groves and stone circles. Their reigns were guided by signs in the sky, by oaths sealed in blood and bone, and by the belief that their lineage carried the favor of forces older than mankind's memory. In the cold forests of the north, leaders were chosen not by inheritance, but by the recognition of power that pulsed through their veins, a shimmer of divine ancestry whispered to have come from God's spirits, or the first ancestors who walked between worlds. Ancient tribes of Europe, from the mist-covered isles to the frozen ridges of the north, held a vision of leadership deeply entwined with the earth itself. Celtic chieftains wore torques that symbolized both bondage and divinity, their circular shape representing eternity. In these tribes, authority was something that had to be constantly renewed through ritual, blood sacrifices, sacred feasts, and alignments with the cycles of the moon. Each ruler was both king and servant, a vessel for the balance between the natural and the spiritual realms. When their power faded, it was not rebellion that unseated them, but the quiet turning of the seasons, a sign from the gods that another must rise. Across the Alps, the Etruscans built their cities upon prophecy. They read omens in the flight of birds, saw divine messages in lightning, and wove their governance around the will of the heavens. Their priest-kings acted as mediators between mortal desire and celestial decree, their blood considered a living thread that connected the mortal world to the realm of the divine. Even in death, their tombs were painted with scenes of eternal feasting, suggesting that kingship was not a role that ended with life, but one that continued beyond the grave. In the eastern valleys where the Danube glides through ancient soil, archaeologists have unearthed burial mounds older than any written story. Within them lie figures adorned in gold and copper, their skulls marked with pigments of red ochre, their bodies surrounded by offerings of grain and weaponry. These were not mere chieftains, they were embodiments of myth. They ruled before the idea of monarchy even existed, before words like dynasty were born, when the notion of power was tied to the fertility of the land and the endurance of the bloodline. In Scandinavia's icy dawn, before Viking kings carved their sagas into history, clan leaders held councils under the gaze of their ancestors. Each lineage claimed descent from gods of sea or storm, and their family trees were sung, not written. Rulers were chosen through trials, through the strength of their spirit as much as their sword. A single drop of noble blood was believed to hold the memory of ancient gods, a trace of fire from realms unseen. To lead meant to remember, to carry the essence of one's forebears as living proof that the divine still walked among mortals. As Europe drifted into the first true civilizations, power began to settle into shapes that would one day resemble crowns. But those early houses, those nameless, half-remembered dynasties, did not fade. They transformed. From their customs grew the later rites of coronation and anointing, the symbols of divine right that would echo through millennia. Every future king who sat upon a throne carried within his veins a shadow of those primal leaders. Their rituals survived in gestures, hands raised to the heavens, crowns kissed before battle, swords buried with kings to guard their spirits. Stories told by wandering bards preserved faint memories of those times. They sang of priestesses who ruled from temples by the sea, of brothers who split kingdoms with stones, of daughters who inherited secrets from the stars. In those myths, the line between history and dream blurred completely. Even when later empires erased their names, the symbols remained. The serpent coiled around the staff, the stag carved into wood, the spiral traced into ancient coin, each a quiet reminder of the houses that came before crowns. By the time the first monarchs began to claim divine descent, the belief in sacred blood was already ancient. It was a relic of an age when rulers were chosen not by conquest but by the unseen pulse of fate. Their descendants would scatter across the continent, their blood mingling with conquerors, prophets, and kings. Though their temples fell, their spirit endured. And from the ashes of their forgotten halls, the next age of rulers would rise, their thrones built upon the bones of myth. When Rome rose from its 7 hills, the idea of kingship shifted from the earth to the heavens. Power no longer drew its strength from soil or storm, but from the notion that blood itself could be holy. The emperors of Rome did not rule because they conquered. They ruled because they were chosen, or so they claimed, by divine will. The transformation of power into divinity began subtly, with rituals inherited from earlier Italic tribes, but it would soon shape the entire foundation of European rule for centuries to come. Julius Caesar's death marked more than the end of a man. It marked the sanctification of blood. Declared a god by the Senate, his lineage became more than human, and his adopted heir, Augustus, fashioned himself as both emperor and high priest of Rome. From that point onward, the imperial family stood at the axis of heaven and earth. To oppose them was not treason against the state, but blasphemy against the sacred order of the cosmos. This was the moment when the river of royal blood became a river of divinity, flowing from Jupiter himself through the veins of mortal rulers. In marble halls and beneath domes painted with stars, Rome's emperors staged their immortality. Statues of them stood beside gods, their faces carved into temples, their names invoked in prayers. Even in their absence, their presence was demanded. The people believed that their breath carried the breath of Rome, that their victories in distant lands were guided by the hands of destiny. The Senate could legislate laws, but only the emperor's blood could sanctify them. Over time, this belief began to weave into Europe's genetic memory. As the empire stretched across continents, Roman governors and noble families intermarried with local dynasties, binding bloodlines from Britain to Egypt. Descendants of Roman senators would one day claim titles as dukes and princes, their ancestry traced through carefully crafted genealogies that linked them somehow to Caesar's divine seed. It was not truth that mattered, it was the belief that their lineage connected them to an eternal order. When Christianity took hold, it did not erase this belief, it absorbed it. The divine emperor became the anointed king, the high priest of Rome, transformed into the ruler by grace of God. The old pagan fire still flickered beneath the new faith. Kings were crowned in cathedrals, but the ritual was the same: oil replacing laurel, cross replacing eagle. Their blood was said to carry divine authority, as though heaven had chosen their family alone to guard creation's balance. From this fusion of empire and sanctity, the concept of the sacred right of kings was born. It became the backbone of European monarchy, a doctrine that would justify wars, dynasties, and endless succession disputes. Even centuries later, when Rome itself was dust, the illusion endured that power was not merely inherited, but consecrated. In forgotten monasteries, scribes traced the imperial lines back to Adam, or even to the gods themselves. Their parchments became weapons of legitimacy. A ruler without lineage could not rule. A ruler with divine ancestry could not be questioned. This belief would outlive the empire, its shadow falling across the crowns of France, Spain, and England long after the eagles of Rome had vanished. When the final emperors of the West fell, they left behind not ruins, but an idea. Power had been rewritten into blood, and blood had been made sacred. The empires to come would not only inherit Rome's architecture and laws, but its invisible empire, the sanctification of lineage. In every coronation, in every royal seal pressed into wax, the spirit of Rome still whispered. And through those whispers, new dynasties would claim their birthright as divine heirs to the eternal city. From the twilight of the Roman world emerged a dynasty that seemed to carry both the light and the shadow of everything that came before. The Merovingians ruled not only through sword and strategy, but through a mystery that surrounded their very existence. They were called the long-haired kings, a name that spoke to more than vanity. Their uncut hair was said to be the mark of their sacred nature, a physical manifestation of their connection to the divine. To touch it without permission was considered sacrilege, for their power was believed to dwell within it, a living link between heaven and earth. Legends told of their founder, Merovech, a figure born from both man and creature of the sea. His conception was said to have occurred when his mother was visited by something beyond human understanding. Some called it a sea god, others a spirit of ancient blood. From that union came a line unlike any other, touched by mystery and bound to fate. Whether myth or symbol, the story gave the Merovingians an aura that no sword could grant. They were not rulers by conquest alone, but inheritors of an ancient spark that had survived since the dawn of kingship. Their realm stretched across the heart of what is now France and Germany, their courts filled with gold, relics and whispers. They anointed themselves with sacred oils said to have descended from heaven, and their advisors were not merely clerics, but keepers of secrets, druids turned Christian monks, guardians of rites older than Scripture. The Merovingians stood at the threshold between the pagan and the Christian, between the world of spirits and the age of empire. Their rule was wrapped in symbols. Coins bore strange markings, their seals intertwined crosses with serpents, and their graves were filled with relics no historian could fully explain. Beneath cathedrals later raised in their honor, archaeologists still find objects that do not belong to any known culture, amulets of unknown origin, carvings that seem to merge human and divine forms. These artifacts suggest that the Merovingians saw themselves not as mere kings, but as custodians of a lineage that predated all others. Their power did not rest on armies alone. It was spiritual, mysterious, almost mythological. Chroniclers of later centuries claimed that they could heal with a touch, that their presence brought fertility to the land, and that their bloodline carried a divine energy others could only imitate. Whether superstition or political genius, this belief kept their authority unshaken. To question a Merovingian's right to rule was to question the will of heaven itself. But power that glows too brightly attracts shadows. Within their courts, ambition stirred. Advisors whispered of kings growing lazy, of bloodlines weakened by inbreeding, of power slipping through silk-clad fingers. Their royal councillors, the mayors of the palace, grew stronger with each passing decade, managing affairs while the kings dwelled in ritual and ceremony. Behind their sacred aura, the line began to fray. Despite their fall, their legacy refused to die. Rumors spread that their descendants lived on, hidden within other dynasties, their blood mingling quietly with those who would one day rule Europe. Some chroniclers even linked them to the guardians of sacred relics, to the keepers of the Grail, to the secret orders that emerged centuries later. Whether truth or invention, the legend of the Merovingians became a code that many sought to decipher, a story that suggested royal blood could never be erased, only concealed. When their final king was dethroned, the world believed the dynasty extinguished. But beneath the surface of Europe's shifting kingdoms, the myth endured. Every noble house that followed, from the Carolingians to the Capetians, lived beneath the shadow of their enigma. Their long hair may have been shorn, their tombs sealed, but their legend flowed silently into the veins of history, an unbroken current waiting to be rediscovered by those who still listen for the whisper of divine blood. Across the fading glow of the Merovingian world, a new force began to rise, a quiet revolution, not of swords but of signatures, councils, and divine redefinition. Where once long-haired kings ruled by mystic inheritance, now came a dynasty that sought legitimacy through reform, through reason, through the Church's blessing. The Carolingians did not inherit the sacred spark. They took it, reshaping the nature of kingship to serve their vision of order. In their hands, the ancient flame of divine right was trimmed, purified, and made obedient to a new structure of power. Charles Martel, the hammer of the Franks, stood at the frontier of this transformation. His victories against invading armies were not merely military triumphs, they were omens. The Church saw in him a savior, a warrior, ordained by heaven to defend Christendom. Through alliance with bishops and abbots, the Carolingians began to craft a sacred narrative of their own. They claimed not descent from sea gods or pagan spirits, but anointing from the Christian God himself. The mysticism of the Merovingians gave way to a new mythology, one of divine service, unity, and sanctioned conquest. When Pepin the Short deposed the last Merovingian king, the act was not described as usurpation, but restoration. Through papal approval, the Carolingian name became synonymous with the will of God on earth. Rome's bishops placed oil upon Pepin's brow, a ritual echo of the old kings, but now with the Church as its interpreter. In that moment, power changed shape again. It moved from the sacred blood of kings to the sacred hand that crowned them. And though the people saw continuity, a subtle theft had taken place. The ancient notion of divine inheritance had been quietly rewritten into divine appointment. Charlemagne, son of Pepin, would complete this transformation with grandeur unseen since the Caesars. His empire was more than land. It was ideology, a rebirth of Rome itself under the cross. His coronation in St. Peter's Basilica, as Emperor of the Romans, sealed the new covenant between crown and altar. He stood as a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages, a man both ruler and priest-king, echoing the forgotten archetypes of the past while wielding the machinery of the future. Through him, blood and faith were bound in one unbreakable chain. Under his reign, scholars copied sacred texts and genealogies that traced his descent to Trojan heroes, even to biblical patriarchs. The Carolingians understood the weapon of lineage. By fabricating continuity, they became heirs not only to the Merovingians, but to every power that came before. Their empire's banners bore crosses instead of serpents, but the intent was the same, to anchor their dominion in eternity. Through learning, law, and piety, they disguised ambition as holiness and conquest as divine necessity. Even as their courts glittered with sanctified ritual, shadows lingered behind the silk and incense. Old loyalties to the Merovingian blood still whispered among monasteries and noble families. The Carolingians ruled over a land still haunted by memory, where the ancient kings were buried beneath churches, their names unspoken but not forgotten. Legends grew of hidden heirs, of relics carrying their essence, of forgotten vows that could undo the order of the new world. Over generations, the Carolingian hold began to falter. Their vast empire, stretched across mountains and rivers, fractured under the weight of inheritance. Sons divided lands, brothers turned against each other, and the sacred unity they had promised dissolved into ambition. The more they tried to sanctify their power, the more human it became. Their bloodline, once portrayed as heaven's chosen vessel, fractured like stained glass struck by sunlight. When the Carolingian Empire finally crumbled, Europe was left not with a single crown, but 1,000 smaller ones. Each ruler claimed descent from Charlemagne. Each wore the symbol of divine favor, and each sought to restore the old unity in his own image. But beneath all those claims, the truth remained clear. The age of sacred inheritance had not ended. It had merely changed disguise. Power, once again, had been stolen and reborn, flowing forward into a web that would soon cover every royal house in Europe. As kingdoms multiplied across the continent, the sword gave way to subtler instruments of conquest. Blood itself became the battlefield, and marriage the weapon that reshaped empires. Instead of armies marching across frontiers, bridal processions carried the fate of nations. Every ring exchange between royal hands tightened the threads of Europe's hidden web, weaving families into a tapestry so intricate that no one could fully untangle it. The Carolingian collapse had left Europe divided, but not disordered. Beneath the shifting banners and the roar of feudal wars, something more deliberate was forming. Nobles began to see unions not as matters of affection or faith, but as currency, alliances written into flesh. Through arranged marriages, territories were joined, disputes dissolved, and thrones secured. It was an invisible diplomacy conducted in chapels, guided by mothers and matrons who understood that a single bloodline could bind centuries of conflict into silence. Every noble daughter became both treasure and trap. Her dowry could bring peace to provinces, but her children could inherit half a continent. To marry her was to inherit her ancestry, her claims, her enemies. Behind every royal betrothal stood councils of priests and chroniclers, calculating how the offspring of such unions might one day unite or dismantle kingdoms. In this way, royal marriage became a slow-moving weapon, patient but devastating. Through centuries, these unions transformed Europe's map more effectively than any crusade. The Capetians bound themselves to the Plantagenets, the Aragonese to the Burgundians, the Habsburgs to the Valois. With every generation, their bloodlines intertwined further until distant cousins ruled rival thrones and families warred against themselves in disguise. Wars of inheritance replaced wars of faith. Each royal child became both hope and danger, a vessel of unity or destruction. Beneath the public splendor of weddings, the private negotiations were darker. Secret clauses, hidden claims, and illegitimate offspring created webs within webs. Royal houses maintained genealogical archives thicker than their scriptures, recording not only who was born but who must never be acknowledged. Illegitimate branches, though publicly denied, often carried the most dangerous potential of all, a drop of royal blood without the burden of royal duty. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had become a continent of cousins. Monarchs addressed one another not as strangers but as kin, their rivalries softened by shared ancestry. The notion of ruling by blood had reached its zenith. It no longer mattered whether a ruler was born in Paris, Prague, or Naples. His veins carried the same interwoven story. Dynastic politics had replaced geography, and power flowed through veins rather than borders. Behind the facade of romance, marriage served an older purpose, the preservation of divine legitimacy. The Church, which once blessed rulers, now found itself bound to their unions, ensuring that each match aligned with celestial order. But papal dispensations could be bought, and morality bent to the needs of empire. Marriages were annulled, replaced, or concealed to secure heirs deemed more suitable to the designs of power. Faith had become another thread in the great web, pliable and precise. Through this labyrinth of lineage, the idea of sovereignty itself began to change. No longer could any king claim to rule by his own will. His power was the result of generations of careful weaving. The throne was not a seat, but a convergence of ancestors. In this vast network of hidden connections, Europe became a single, breathing organism, its veins filled with blue blood, its heart beating to the rhythm of family ambition. Those who could read the web understood its true power. Beneath crowns and coats of arms, beneath treaties and wars, lay an invisible design that governed everything. And as this design spread, reaching eastward across the old Byzantine lands, the idea of divine lineage prepared to meet its reflection in another empire, one born from Rome's last light. Far beyond the forests of the Franks, in a realm where mosaics glowed like stars and incense thickened the air, the Eastern Empire endured. While the West fragmented into kingdoms, the Byzantines guarded an unbroken chain stretching back to Augustus himself. Their emperors did not rule as mere monarchs, but as living symbols of divine order. Every coronation was a ritual echo of creation, a reenactment of the moment heaven touched earth. Their blood, they claimed, carried the very essence of the Roman ideal, an eternal authority that no barbarian conquest could erase. In Constantinople, beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia, each emperor was anointed not only as ruler, but as sacred vessel. The golden robes, the purple sandals, the throne flanked by mechanical lions, all served to remind courtiers that they stood before more than man. The imperial family's genealogy was guarded as a relic, its connections drawn not merely through marriage, but through visions, omens, and divine dreams. To be born within the purple chamber of the palace was to be born as living proof of celestial favor. Even as the West turned toward feudal chaos, Byzantium remained a citadel of refinement and secrecy. Marriage within its imperial house was governed by cosmic precision. A union was never just political, it was metaphysical, aligning stars and prophecies to secure balance between heaven and empire. When emperors sought brides from distant lands, it was not merely diplomacy but alchemy, the mixing of divine bloodlines to rejuvenate the sacred flame. Through these unions, threads of Byzantine ancestry spread westward. Princes of the Holy Roman Empire boasted of kinship with Constantinople. Italian dukes married daughters of the Komnenoi and Palaiologoi, believing that such unions infused their lines with imperial legitimacy. Even northern monarchs distant from the Mediterranean claimed faint echoes of Byzantine descent through centuries of intermarriage. Like veins of gold running beneath rock, those connections remained hidden but enduring. The Byzantines, however, guarded their heritage with jealousy. While Western rulers wore crowns of metal, the Emperor of the East was crowned in a mystery of words and gestures. Coronation prayers were whispered in ancient tongues, their meanings lost even to those who spoke them. Chronicles spoke of relics kept beneath the palace, shards of the true cross, drops of Christ's blood, and ancient scrolls describing the first anointing of Adam by God. In such a world, royal lineage was not mere history, it was theology. Beyond the grandeur of ceremony, the Byzantine court was a maze of intrigue. Eunuchs, scholars, and saints all moved in careful silence, guarding the empire's divine myth. To reveal too much was treason. To question ancestry was sacrilege. Over centuries, this veil of secrecy became their shield, and through it, the idea of sacred rulership survived unbroken, while the West reinvented itself again and again. When the Crusaders arrived, they brought swords and greed, but also curiosity. Many among them returned home with tales of imperial wonders, the purple silk, the celestial rites, the vision of a ruler who seemed half angel. Those stories infiltrated Europe's courts, igniting an obsession with legitimacy through divinity. Western kings began to imitate the Byzantine model, crafting ceremonies that echoed its grandeur, seeking relics that could rival its holiness. The East had become a mirror that showed the West what it desired most, the illusion of eternity. Even as Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, the idea it carried did not perish. Its bloodlines scattered into exile, mingling quietly with Venetian nobles, Russian princes, and Balkan lords. Through these unions, the last fragments of Rome's sacred flame passed westward once more. The Byzantines had kept the spirit of divine monarchy alive through centuries of storms, and through their descendants, that spirit found new hosts among Europe's shadow kings, those who would continue to rule, unseen but unbroken, as the web of blood tightened around a continent that could never escape its past. Across the northern seas, where storms carved the cliffs of forgotten coasts, a new kind of dynasty was born. They came from mist and salt, hardened by exile and conquest, speaking a tongue shaped by both Norse and Frankish breath. The Normans carried no ancient crown, but they possessed a hunger that no established house could match. What they lacked in divine ancestry, they compensated with ferocity, cunning, and an uncanny instinct for survival. In their rise, Europe witnessed not the continuation of old power, but its reinvention through steel and blood. From the marshes of Normandy to the green fields of England, they moved like shadows reborn into light. Their founder, Rollo, had once been a raider, a man of chaos who became a builder of order. Granted lands by the Frankish king, he swore allegiance, yet never surrendered spirit. His descendants learned to weave both violence and diplomacy into a single weapon. When William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel in 1066, he carried not only an army, but the weight of centuries of ambition. His victory at Hastings was more than conquest. It was a declaration that destiny could be seized, not inherited. The Norman expansion was as much a migration of ideas as of armies. Across England, Sicily, and parts of the Mediterranean, they erected castles like seeds of authority, stone symbols of permanence where none had existed. In each fortress, they imposed not only rule, but memory, embedding their presence into the landscape itself. The stones they raised were both defensive walls and monuments to bloodline. Their architecture was their scripture, massive, austere, eternal. Through marriage and calculated alliances, the Normans threaded themselves into Europe's royal fabric with surgical precision. William's descendants intermarried with the daughters of Scots, French, and Iberian nobility, binding their northern vigor to southern legitimacy. Their offspring ruled not as foreigners but as inheritors of divine right, blending Norse ferocity with the Polish of Christian monarchy. They became the living bridge between pagan valor and ecclesiastical order, between sword and scripture. Behind the armor and the banners, however, lay a subtler vision. The Normans saw themselves as agents of destiny, chosen by Providence to unify the scattered realms of Europe. Their chroniclers compared them to Roman emperors, their deeds to the will of heaven. Every conquest was retold as divine fulfillment, every marriage a sign of cosmic approval. Through legend and ink, they transformed their origins from raiders to rulers, from wanderers to chosen heirs of the continent's sacred story. In Sicily, they forged a kingdom unlike any other, where Latin, Greek, and Arabic tongues mingled under a single rule. Kings such as Roger II presided over courts filled with scholars, astronomers, and priests of every faith, creating a synthesis that mirrored the complexity of their lineage. The Norman blood that coursed through Sicily's royal veins carried not only northern steel but eastern wisdom. Through them, Europe's medieval identity began to merge with the legacy of Byzantium and the echoes of Islam, forming a cultural empire more powerful than any army. Though their reigns often burned brightly and briefly, their influence proved enduring. From the Plantagenets to the Angevins, from Crusader lords to kings of Jerusalem, Norman blood became the quiet architect of dynastic Europe. Even when their name disappeared from official titles, their spirit lingered, ambitious, adaptable, untamed. They taught future houses that legitimacy could be manufactured, that sacred ancestry could be forged through victory, and that a dynasty's myth mattered more than its origin. As generations passed, their descendants continued to shape destiny from behind the veil of lineage. The Norman story became less about a people and more about a pattern, a method of conquest that used genealogy as its armor. Wherever their blood flowed, crowns followed, carried by men and women who believed that power was not inherited, but claimed through will. They had stepped from shadow into light, and in doing so, ensured that Europe would forever belong to those who dared to rewrite its history. Among the ruins of Crusader fortresses and the silence of forgotten monasteries, whispers still linger of an order that vanished in fire but may never have truly died. The Knights Templar were warriors, bankers, mystics, and, according to many legends, guardians of bloodlines too sacred for kings to control. Behind their white mantles and crimson crosses lay secrets that bound them not only to Christendom, but to something far older, a hidden continuity that linked ancient dynasties to medieval faith. Their rise was meteoric. From humble beginnings as protectors of pilgrims, they grew into a force that rivaled monarchs. Kings borrowed from them, popes blessed them, and nations feared their influence. They built fortresses across Europe and the Holy Land, each constructed with an uncanny precision that seemed more symbolic than military. Some of their architecture echoed sacred geometry, its patterns aligning with ancient temples and forgotten shrines. To their followers, the Templars were not merely soldiers, they were custodians of divine order. Within their ranks flowed the sons of noble families from across the continent. Younger heirs of dynasties sent to serve God returned as initiates of an inner mystery. Their vows of poverty masked wealth beyond imagination. Their silence concealed a secret heritage that may have reached back to the Merovingians themselves. Chroniclers spoke of secret genealogies kept in hidden archives, tracing descent not from kings alone, but from holy blood, a lineage that began, according to whispers, in Jerusalem. As their power grew, so did suspicion. Monarchs saw rivals in their discipline, and priests questioned their devotion. Accusations of heresy became weapons in political games, and behind the charges of idolatry or blasphemy lay a deeper fear, that the Templars possessed knowledge that could unseat crowns. Rumors claimed they had uncovered relics proving that divine right belonged not to Rome or any throne, but to an older line concealed through centuries of manipulation. When King Philip IV of France ordered their arrest, it was not merely greed for their treasure that guided him, but terror of their mystery. The suddenness of their fall, the executions, and the destruction of their order were acts of erasure. But the question that followed burned across generations. What did they protect, and where did it go? Legends tell that on the night before their capture, a fleet of ships slipped from the harbor of La Rochelle, vanishing into the fog, carrying gold, relics, and perhaps the last keepers of an unbroken bloodline. Through centuries, echoes of the Templars reappeared under new names and symbols, the Rosicrucians, Freemasons, secret fraternities whispering of ancient descent. Monarchs who persecuted the order later sought alliances with these shadowed heirs, their families intermarrying through intermediaries, preserving what could not be destroyed by decree. Across Europe, hidden archives and chapel carvings hinted at their continued presence, masked by religion and royalty alike. The idea that the Templars were not extinguished but transmuted fascinated historians and mystics alike. Their supposed descendants were said to dwell among noble families in Portugal, Scotland, and France, guiding history's tides through counsel, wealth, and invisible influence. Whether truth or myth, their legend reshaped the meaning of nobility itself. A king might claim blood of Charlemagne or Caesar, but those who traced lineage to the Templars claimed something deeper, guardianship of divine heritage. Their story became less about treasure and more about continuity. The gold they lost mattered less than the seed they may have planted, an unbroken chain of belief in sacred blood disguised behind the ordinary faces of Europe's elite. The Templar secret was not about what they owned, but what they preserved. The idea that true sovereignty lies not in crowns or nations, but in those who remember. Through the green valleys of England and the cold stone halls of France, the blood of the Plantagenets coursed like a storm, beautiful, relentless, destructive. They were heirs to Norman ambition, Carolingian myth, and perhaps even the echo of older, sacred lines. Their rule stretched from the cliffs of Anjou to the highlands of Scotland, binding the island and the continent in a single, restless empire of will. But within their veins, the divine inheritance that once united kings began to turn inward, consuming itself through rivalry and pride. Born from Geoffrey of Anjou and Matilda, daughter of a king, the Plantagenets rose on the fusion of two powerful legacies. Their symbol, a sprig of broom, or Plantagenista, became a living emblem of endurance, rooted in both humility and strength. But beneath that emblem lay a dynasty forever divided by its own brilliance. Henry II's sons fought not only enemies, but each other, and their wars were not merely for crowns, but for the right to claim the truest inheritance of their blood. Their reign was an age of paradox. Under their rule came law and chaos, chivalry and treachery, poetry and execution. They sponsored the construction of cathedrals while spilling blood in holy wars. They raised England to glory even as they tore it apart. For them, power was both inheritance and curse. Chroniclers spoke of omens surrounding their line, lions devouring roses, blood-staining banners of gold. Every victory they achieved carried the shadow of ruin. Within their family, the concept of sacred lineage took on new meaning. Royal marriages became weapons sharper than blades, binding their children to rivals in France, Spain, and Aquitaine. Each generation tangled itself deeper into Europe's web until Plantagenet blood could be found in nearly every court. They saw themselves not as rulers of nations, but as masters of destiny's thread, chosen to continue the divine experiment begun by their ancestors. The Wars of the Roses revealed the full cost of that inheritance. Descendants of the same ancestor raised armies against one another, claiming the right to rule through the purity of their descent. Lancaster and York were not merely political factions. They were mirror images of one lineage split in two, each convinced it carried the last unbroken trace of divine right. Their battlefields became altars, their banners prayers written in steel. Behind the chaos, the old dream of sacred blood persisted. Chroniclers compared their struggle to ancient myths. The sons of gods turned against each other, the fall of divine houses into dust. Whether on the fields of Towton or Bosworth, the wars were not only about England's crown, but about the survival of an idea that one family alone had been chosen to bear the ancient spark of legitimacy. When the final Tudor banner rose over the fallen House of York, it did not mark the extinction of that flame. Through marriage and survival, Plantagenet blood flowed quietly into the veins of Europe's remaining dynasties. Across centuries, it would reappear in the genealogies of Bourbon, Habsburg, and Hanover alike. The lions and roses still lived, disguised under new coats of arms, whispering the same ancient creed. That power may sleep, but it never truly dies. Their legacy was not simply the creation of kingdoms, but the perpetuation of a pattern, ambition bound by blood, rivalry disguised as destiny. Through them, Europe learned that even divine inheritance carries thorns, and that every crown is haunted by the memory of those who bled to wear it. The Plantagenets built cathedrals and conquered continents, but their greatest creation was invisible, a labyrinth of ancestry that still winds through the corridors of history, its echoes heard whenever a ruler dares to call himself chosen. Across abbeys and royal chancelleries, behind locked doors and beneath layers of dust, generations of scribes devoted their lives to a single purpose: preserving bloodlines. They copied, translated, and adjusted records with a precision that blurred truth into legend, creating an unbroken chain of legitimacy stretching back through centuries. Their pens were weapons as sharp as any blade, shaping dynasties through ink and secrecy. To rule was to exist within those manuscripts, for a king without lineage was as fragile as parchment exposed to flame. Within monasteries that dotted the European landscape, the work of record-keeping carried an almost religious weight. Illuminated manuscripts glowed beneath candlelight as monks traced lineages not only of saints, but of kings. Each connection, each name, was sanctified with divine symbolism. But behind the beauty of their art hid manipulation. A misplaced ancestor could justify a war, an invented marriage could unite entire nations. Genealogy became alchemy, turning obscure blood into royal gold. Among these records lay hidden truths and deliberate forgeries. Chroniclers were instructed to shape history to favor their patrons, to erase inconvenient unions or insert pious forebears where sin had once ruled. A bastard could be recast as a prophet's descendant, a usurper transformed into heaven's instrument. Across the centuries, kings paid handsomely to be descended from heroes they never knew. While ancient lines were quietly severed from the narrative, their names struck from scrolls as if they had never existed. In the catacombs beneath palaces, secret archives grew into labyrinths of genealogy guarded by archivists sworn to silence. Notaries and priests, those invisible architects of royal identity, understood that power depended on perception. They maintained dual histories, one for the public, another for the blood itself. Behind the official line of succession often lay hidden branches, illegitimate heirs concealed within monasteries, daughters married under false names, sons recorded as dead but spirited away to distant lands. Through these concealed documents, dynasties maintained continuity across generations of upheaval. When revolutions burned libraries and toppled crowns, hidden copies survived in cloisters and private collections. Certain families never lost their titles entirely because their ancestry was safeguarded in places even conquerors could not reach. Within those fragile pages, centuries whispered to one another. Every name, every seal carried the heartbeat of a nation's identity, preserved in ink long after flesh had turned to dust. Scholars who dared explore these records uncovered patterns too deliberate to dismiss. Across kingdoms, names repeated in rhythms that seemed orchestrated, Henrys and Louises, Isabellas and Edwards, echoes of ancient prototypes reborn in each century. It was as if blood itself followed a design, looping through generations to keep the illusion of continuity alive. In certain vaults, forbidden genealogies were said to link medieval kings directly to biblical patriarchs, merging myth and monarchy into a single tapestry. Whispers persisted of archives so secret that even rulers did not know of their existence. Hidden in remote abbeys or beneath city cathedrals, they were said to contain the true record of Europe's royal blood, the unaltered lineage that traced every throne back to a common ancestor. Guardians of these archives passed their knowledge orally, bound by vows older than Christianity itself. To them, bloodlines were not merely biological, but mystical, threads of destiny connecting souls across time. Through centuries of wars and reformations, those keepers survived. Monarchs came and went, religions fractured, borders shifted, but the archivists remained, preserving the continuity of power through memory. Their silence was their strength. For every history, written for public eyes, another waited beneath it, older and darker, a mirror version of Europe's past, where truth was not printed but whispered in candlelight. Across the wide expanse of Europe's mountains and valleys, one family learned to rule without war. The Habsburgs built their empire not through conquest but through the art of marriage, weaving alliances so intricate that their bloodlines soon encircled half the continent. From their ancestral seat in the Austrian Alps, they reached outward like vines, binding kingdoms through vows and signatures, through sons and daughters sent to foreign thrones. Each union expanded their dominion until the very map of Europe seemed to pulse with their name. Their motto, whispered through courts and councils, became prophecy. Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry. Through this strategy, their dynasty absorbed crowns as if by gravity. From Bohemia to Spain, from Hungary to the Netherlands, Habsburg heirs multiplied across the continent, their faces reflected in paintings from Madrid to Prague. Unlike earlier conquerors, they did not need armies to dominate. Their power was genetic, patient, inexorable. Every royal wedding was another step in the quiet conquest of Europe's blood. The secret to their endurance lay in unity, disguised as diversity. Habsburg offspring ruled distant lands, yet maintained a shared identity rooted in divine election. They presented themselves as stewards of Christendom, guardians of faith against heresy and chaos. To their subjects, the dynasty appeared eternal, ordained by heaven to preserve order. Even their physical features, the long jaw, the austere gaze, became symbols of divine inheritance, as though their very bodies bore proof of legitimacy. Behind their vast network of courts, however, the family maintained an intricate system of internal surveillance. Marriages were not left to chance. Every union was calculated to reinforce control, to ensure that titles, territories, and loyalties remained within reach. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, until bloodlines folded inward like mirrors reflecting themselves. Over generations, the dynasty became a labyrinth of ancestry, each branch leading back to the same root. The consequences of this insularity were visible both in health and fate. Faces grew similar, minds fragile, and bodies frail. But within that decay burned an unyielding belief in destiny. The Habsburgs saw themselves as the living embodiment of divine geometry, a family whose internal unity mirrored the perfection of heaven. Their empire, vast and multiform, became a physical manifestation of their bloodline, an organism stretching from ocean to steppe, breathing through marriage contracts instead of lungs. At their height, their dominion touched nearly every kingdom. Spanish monarchs bore Austrian blood, Italian dukes served their kin, emperors in Vienna wielded influence across the New World. Their family trees read like maps, every branch connected to another by treaties, inheritances, and papal blessings. Where their ancestors had once raised fortresses, the Habsburgs raised genealogies, stronger, more enduring, and immune to siege. As the centuries turned, their labyrinth deepened. Secret councils debated the purity of bloodlines, ensuring no outsider diluted their heritage. Artists and theologians were employed to craft imagery, portraying their family as chosen by divine will. Even the sun and moon appeared in their emblems, symbols of cosmic unity bound by royal blood. Through ritual, portraiture, and endless ceremony, they elevated themselves beyond humanity into myth. When revolutions finally swept across Europe, toppling monarchs and burning palaces, the Habsburg presence lingered. Their alliances, woven through centuries, survived the fall of borders. Though their empire fractured, their lineage endured through marriages into nearly every surviving royal house. They had turned blood into architecture, an invisible citadel that no rebellion could fully destroy. Their name became less a dynasty and more a condition, a state of being that outlasted kings, nations, and time itself. Across centuries of dynastic turmoil, history recorded its heirs and rulers, but between the lines of official chronicles ran a parallel story, one of those erased from succession, yet never forgotten. For every crowned head that shone in the light of ceremony, another vanished into exile, cloister, or legend. They were the lost princes, hidden daughters, and heirs concealed to protect both blood and power. Their absence shaped history as profoundly as the reigns of those who remained. Royal courts were filled with whispers about children spirited away on stormy nights, infants whose deaths were proclaimed but whose bodies were never shown. Chroniclers told of heirs replaced by doubles, of babies exchanged in cradles, of bastards legitimized through forged seals. Whether by politics, survival, or divine manipulation, Europe's royal families became adept at vanishing their own blood when necessary. Every disappearance hid an inheritance, every rumor preserved a trace of the forbidden lineage. Among the most haunting tales were those of the Valois princes of France, the Romanovs of Russia, and the Stuarts of Britain. Each carried its own myth of survival: a child rescued by loyal retainers, a secret marriage producing descendants who blended into ordinary society, a forgotten grave concealing a life that continued under another name. Over time, these legends grew into faiths of their own, each generation rediscovering supposed heirs, claiming lost thrones through symbols, rings, or uncanny resemblance. Political necessity often demanded such concealments. When war or scandal threatened the stability of a realm, a missing heir became both shield and weapon. Hidden children could later be used to legitimize new claims or destabilize rivals. Cloisters and convents became sanctuaries for royal blood, places where unwanted heirs could grow in silence, protected by vows of secrecy. In those dim corridors, history was rewritten, one life at a time. Beneath the outward piety of monastic life, the reality was far more complex. Some of those concealed were educated, trained, and prepared to one day re-emerge when the time was right. Secret orders and guardians were said to watch over them, passing messages and tokens through generations. To the outside world, these children were lost. To those who guarded them, they were living relics, vessels of a promise that could not be extinguished by time or exile. Certain families built their entire identity upon such mysteries. Genealogists and mystics alike traced noble blood through obscure marriages, discovering patterns that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. Across Europe, minor aristocratic houses suddenly rose in prominence, their fortunes growing alongside their claims of descent from forgotten lines. Their estates hid portraits whose features resembled dead kings. Their vaults contained seals of long-vanished dynasties. Through them, the missing heirs of history continued to rule, though unseen. The psychological power of lost lineage shaped not only politics but culture itself. Ballads, epics, and romances turned vanished heirs into archetypes of divine return, the sleeping king who would awaken, the child of prophecy who would reclaim the realm. Such stories were not mere entertainment, they were echoes of a collective memory that refused to let bloodlines die. Every people, it seemed, carried within it the longing for a rightful return, a restoration of what had been hidden. Across modern Europe, quiet families in remote villages still guard heirlooms of uncertain origin, rings inscribed with royal seals, manuscripts written in archaic script, portraits of ancestors with faces too regal to belong to farmers. Scholars dismiss them as coincidences, but legends persist that the blood of ancient kings continues to flow, disguised beneath humble names. For in Europe's long night, power never vanishes completely. It merely hides behind another face, waiting for its moment to be recognized again. In candlelit chambers deep within royal palaces, long before the language of science took shape, men in silken robes and women cloaked in secrecy sought not gold, but immortality. Their experiments were not confined to furnaces and glass vessels. They dealt in ancestry, transmutation, and the perfection of blood. To them, alchemy was not a quest for wealth. It was an attempt to refine the essence of human lineage, to distill divine power through generations. Within courts from Prague to Florence, alchemists whispered that the philosopher's stone was not a mineral at all, but a metaphor for perfected heritage, a legacy so pure that it could defy death. Emperors, kings, and dukes patronized these mysterious figures, not merely for the promise of eternal youth, but to secure their place in the invisible chain of divine succession. Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire turned his castle into a laboratory of hidden wonders, gathering scholars, mystics, and dreamers who sought the key to transmutation. Beneath frescoed ceilings, retorts hissed and manuscripts glimmered with coded diagrams. In those circles, alchemy and genealogy became one, experiments of lineage, as if noble blood could be refined like metal until it reached celestial purity. Among these seekers emerged theories that royal blood carried a sacred frequency, an energy that could be strengthened or weakened by union, ritual, or intent. Alchemists mapped family trees as if they were formulas, predicting which marriages would produce rulers of genius and which would yield decline. Their work blurred boundaries between magic, mathematics, and biology, centuries before the language of genetics would exist. In their illuminated manuscripts, diagrams of planetary alignments stood beside sketches of human hearts, symbolizing the cosmic symmetry between heaven and heritage. Hidden laboratories beneath abbeys and cathedrals became sanctuaries for these experiments. Flasks and furnaces stood beside relics of saints, merging chemistry with mysticism. The alchemists' patrons believed that by understanding the divine structure of matter, they could also decode the pattern of royal destiny. Marriage became transmutation, coronation a form of ritual refinement. Through their secret art, dynasties sought to bind themselves to eternity, crafting not merely kingdoms but bloodlines designed to last forever. Within this union of science and superstition, a darker current flowed. The pursuit of perfection often turned inward, leading to obsession with purity that shaped entire policies and alliances. Dynastic unions were planned with almost alchemical precision, meant to preserve qualities deemed celestial: beauty, intellect, prophecy, or divine favor. Behind every arranged marriage, every anointing with sacred oil, lay a silent experiment in legacy. Power was no longer only an inheritance, it became a formula to be repeated, refined, and guarded. Royal physicians and scholars who dabbled in this craft began to speak of living elixirs, secret tonics made from the essence of youth, from substances believed to carry vitality and spiritual energy. The blood of royal children, mixed with rare metals or holy water, was rumored to form the base of these elixirs, though such claims remain buried in coded writings. Whether symbolic or literal, the belief persisted that within certain veins flowed the secret to transcendence. Monarchs drank from chalices during coronation, not only as a sign of faith, but as an alchemical act, affirming that their bodies had become vessels of the eternal. These ideas seeped into the philosophy of secret societies that flourished during the Renaissance. Orders cloaked in Latin mottos and astrological symbols viewed royal ancestry as proof of an ancient covenant between man and cosmos. They preserved texts describing how to awaken divine consciousness through blood, tracing their knowledge back to Egypt, Chaldea, and the mysteries of the East. Within their rituals, the monarch's lineage symbolized the perfect union of opposites: sun and moon, spirit and flesh, mortal and immortal. While scholars later dismissed such practices as delusion, the influence of royal alchemy endured. It transformed the way dynasties viewed themselves, convincing rulers that their blood carried more than history, it carried purpose. Portraits of kings began to shimmer with esoteric symbols, their robes embroidered with stars, suns and serpents, all echoing the eternal cycle of transformation. Even as the age of science dawned, the old dream persisted in secret chambers, that through the mastery of both matter and memory, blood itself could become immortal. Across glittering halls filled with chandeliers and mirrors, the Bourbon kings reigned as living symbols of divine perfection. Their courts shimmered with ritual, their every gesture choreographed to affirm celestial authority. In Versailles, beneath ceilings painted with gods and angels, the monarch stood at the center of the world, a sun surrounded by planets of courtiers and nobles. But beneath this radiant order, a quiet decay had begun. The age that once revered divine blood had grown restless, and the very idea of sanctified rule began to crumble under its own opulence. Louis XIV, the Sun King, embodied the apotheosis of hereditary power. His reign represented not only dominance, but artistry, royalty elevated to theatre. Each dawn ceremony and evening procession reenacted creation itself, turning monarchy into a living myth. The people saw him as chosen by heaven, his presence both awe and burden. Through him, the Bourbon blood reached its brightest flame, illuminating Europe's courts with splendor that disguised a gathering storm. Behind the golden facade, the cost of divine lineage became visible. Wars fought for prestige drained treasuries, and marriages meant to secure peace instead spread instability. The same belief in sacred inheritance that had once bound nations now divided them. Across Europe, Enlightenment thinkers questioned whether noble blood differed at all from that of peasants. In the salons of Paris, philosophers whispered what monarchs feared most, that the divine right of kings was nothing more than an ancient illusion. The Bourbons responded with greater ceremony, attempting to reassert their cosmic importance. Coronations grew more elaborate, portraits more radiant, and symbols of divine ancestry more overt. But no ritual could restore the fading faith of a new age awakening to reason. The court became a dream detached from reality, its refinement mocking the hunger that grew outside its gates. Where earlier dynasties had drawn strength from mystery, the Bourbons suffocated beneath their own myth. As revolutions ignited across the continent, blue blood flowed not through coronation chalices but into the streets. Exile became the new inheritance of kings. Carriages that once bore brides now carried refugees, their jewels sewn into garments, their crests scraped from trunks. Monarchs fled across borders, their names changed to survive, their ancestral portraits hidden in cellars. But even stripped of titles, the idea of their blood remained potent, a memory of order in a world remade by chaos. From exile, scattered branches of royal families intermarried once more, this time in secret, forging new alliances among fallen thrones. Across Europe's quieter towns, descendants of Bourbon, Habsburg, and Romanov houses mingled, their unions no longer matters of state but of survival. Though their crowns were lost, their consciousness of lineage endured. They were taught from birth that they carried the residue of divine purpose, a spark of something that could never fully die. Through the 19th century, blue blood adapted to modernity. Royal descendants became diplomats, bankers, and industrialists, continuing to influence nations through commerce instead of command. Their names appeared in discrete partnerships, their ancestral estates converted into museums or universities, but their connections remained intact. The language of lineage transformed from theology into heritage, but the web of descent still defined Europe's hidden hierarchy. In palaces that survived revolution, portraits of long-dead kings watched over republics pretending to be free of monarchy. The Bourbon spirit, though humbled, persisted as an echo of elegance, a symbol of what civilization once believed about itself. That order could be inherited, that virtue could be born. Behind the glass of museum displays, crowns and scepters glimmered like relics of a vanished faith, while descendants of their bearers continued to move quietly through the world, carrying in their veins the last flicker of divine privilege. As Europe embraced the language of democracy, its ancient dynasties learned to disappear. Crowns were melted, thrones dismantled, but the bloodlines behind them did not fade. They evolved. No longer bound to palaces or armies, these families found new arenas: finance, diplomacy, art, and politics. The age of kings gave way to the age of influence, where the heirs of monarchs shaped nations from behind the veil of modern institutions. Their signatures no longer appeared on decrees, but on contracts, treaties, and charitable foundations that steered history with a quieter hand. Revolutions had taught them the cost of visibility. Power survived best when hidden beneath the surface of ideals. Descendants of dethroned royals entered parliaments, founded banks, and married into wealthy merchant families, merging nobility with enterprise. Through these unions, they preserved both status and relevance, weaving their heritage into the very structure of the modern world. A republic might abolish monarchy, but it could not abolish lineage, especially when that lineage controlled capital, land, and influence disguised as civic virtue. In London, Vienna, and Paris, salons once reserved for royalty became gathering places for financiers, scientists, and reformers, many bearing surnames that traced back to medieval kings. Their conversations shaped empires that no longer relied on divine right, but on persuasion and perception. The same families who once ruled by decree now guided society through diplomacy, philanthropy, and culture. Monarchic power had dissolved into something subtler, something far more enduring, the ability to define what was civilized, respectable, and inevitable. Across the Atlantic, exiled princes and duchesses found new homes among industrial dynasties. Through marriage, ancient blood mingled with the fortunes of steel and oil, blending medieval prestige with modern capital. The result was a hybrid aristocracy, part royal, part economic, whose authority rested not on birth alone, but on the illusion of continuity. Their children attended universities instead of coronations, but behind their education lingered the same awareness. They were inheritors of something older than nations themselves. While the world celebrated the triumph of equality, the structure of old Europe persisted beneath new symbols. Flags changed, parliaments rose, constitutions were written, but influence still flowed through familiar veins. Discreetly managed trusts and family estates ensured that ancient fortunes remained intact. Royal descendants sat on corporate boards, advised presidents, and shaped diplomacy through networks invisible to the public. The monarchy had become conceptual, a lineage of guidance rather than command. This invisible aristocracy cultivated a different kind of mystique. No longer divine by decree, they became guardians of heritage, patrons of art and science, symbols of continuity in a century obsessed with change. When wars broke out, they maneuvered behind the scenes, arranging truces and marriages as their ancestors once did. Their neutrality, born from centuries of adaptation, made them indispensable intermediaries in an era of ideology and chaos. In their quiet estates and ancestral villas, traditions persisted. Family trees were still updated by private secretaries. Archives of letters and diaries were guarded as carefully as relics. Portraits of medieval ancestors hung beside photographs of modern statesmen, merging centuries into a single continuous identity. The ancient idea of divine right had transformed into cultural legitimacy, proof that civilization's roots were not severed, but disguised. Even today, the influence of those bloodlines hums beneath the surface of Europe's modern republics. While politicians rise and fall, these families remain consultants, diplomats, patrons of the arts, still guiding through lineage what they once ruled by law. Their invisibility is their crown, their discretion the throne they now occupy. Power, having learned its lesson from history, discovered that to endure, it must no longer be seen. Across the frozen fjords and dark pine forests of the north, power took on a shape unlike that of any other European realm. Here, where winter ruled for half the year and the sea devoured those who misread its moods, kingship was carved from survival itself. Before castles and crowns, there were jarls and chieftains who traced their descent not from gods of scripture, but from forces of nature, thunder, ocean, flame, frost. Their rule was elemental, their lineage sung in sagas that blurred history with myth. In this harsh landscape, ancestry became both shield and sword, for only those born of divine lineage could hope to tame such merciless lands. Long before Christianity reached the northern shores, the bloodlines of Scandinavia's rulers were bound to the gods themselves. Norse kings claimed descent from Odin, the wanderer whose wisdom and sacrifice gave mankind its spirit. His supposed descendants walked the earth with a mixture of fear and reverence surrounding them, their right to command secured not by birth alone, but by their ability to embody divine will. Every battle became a ritual of destiny, every victory proof that the ancient blood still burned. When priests from the south preached humility and peace, northern rulers listened but never fully surrendered their belief that strength was sacred. As pagan shrines gave way to churches, the northern dynasties adapted. Conversion was not submission but transformation. The old gods were replaced with saints, but their stories lingered in new forms. Kings who once claimed descent from Odin now spoke of divine favor through Christ, though their symbols, wolves, ravens, dragons, remained carved into stone and banner. The fusion of old and new faiths created monarchies of unique duality, Christian in word, but mythic in soul. Their coronations echoed baptism and blot alike, blending holy water with ancestral fire. Through the centuries, Scandinavia's royal families maintained a sense of independence rare in Europe. While southern dynasties entangled themselves through endless marriages, northern rulers guarded their blood with a different kind of pride, one rooted in identity rather than expansion. Their alliances were often forged through deeds rather than unions, their loyalty tested in battle rather than ceremony. Even as Europe's political web tightened, the northern thrones remained distinct, carrying an older rhythm in their veins. Sagas preserved by skalds served as both archive and scripture. They recorded not only wars and voyages, but genealogies reaching back to the dawn of the world. Through those verses, each generation reaffirmed its connection to the past. Kings were not remembered for their conquests alone, but for how their deeds echoed the patterns of their ancestors. To forget one's lineage was to lose one's place in the great song of existence, for memory itself was the crown every ruler bore. As the Viking Age faded, its legacy did not die. It evolved. Northern blood spread across Europe through conquest and marriage, seeding royal houses from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. The descendants of seafarers became emperors, queens, and dukes, carrying with them the memory of sagas disguised beneath Christian names. Their sense of destiny, born from cold seas and burning skies, continued to shape Europe's imagination long after their long ships vanished from the waves. Even in modern monarchies, traces of this ancient lineage endure. Scandinavian rulers retain titles that link them to Odin's sons, and their coats of arms still display creatures of fire and frost. Their endurance speaks to a cultural truth. That myth, once woven into blood, becomes inseparable from identity. The North taught Europe that divine ancestry need not die. It can adapt like ice that melts only to return each winter, unchanged in essence. Within these cold realms, power remains quiet, almost humble, yet it is built on something older than empire or doctrine, a memory of when kings spoke with gods, and gods bled like men. Through those memories, the northern bloodline continues to pulse, its rhythm slow and eternal, like the northern lights flickering across an endless night. Behind every dynasty chronicled by scribes and sculptors stood women whose power was spoken of only in whispers. Their names were often omitted from official histories, their portraits relegated to the margins of memory, but their influence ran deeper than ink or marble could capture. They were matchmakers, regents, and alchemists of lineage, shaping the future of Europe from behind veils and doors that history rarely dared to open. Through marriage, negotiation, and survival, they became the true architects of continuity. the invisible pillars that held entire dynasties upright when kings faltered. From early medieval queens who navigated tribal rivalries to Renaissance consorts guiding entire courts through intrigue, their skill lay not in open rule, but in subtle orchestration. They mastered the language of power spoken in glances and gestures, where alliances were born not in battlefields but in bedrooms and banquets. Through their children they bound kingdoms, through their correspondence they swayed wars. A single letter written in secret by a queen could shift the fate of nations more effectively than an army's march. Many of these women were educated far beyond their peers, versed in philosophy, theology, and diplomacy. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine moved between courts like chess masters, weaving alliances that redefined Europe's geography. Others, such as Isabella of Castile or Catherine de' Medici, carried both vision and ruthlessness, reshaping empires through will and intellect. To the public, they were symbols of virtue. To those who knew them, they were living embodiments of power, disguised in grace. In the shadows of cathedrals, noble women served as preservers of heritage, commissioning chronicles, endowing monasteries, and ensuring that family histories were recorded. They understood that memory was the true weapon of monarchy. Through patronage of the arts and religion, they inscribed their family's glory into the very fabric of culture. Painters, poets, and chroniclers owed them their livelihood, and through their pens and brushes, the Queen's influence survived long after their bodies turned to dust. Their role in the transmission of bloodlines was both sacred and perilous. To bear a royal child was to shape destiny itself. Behind closed doors, physicians, midwives, and priests hovered in anxious reverence as queens delivered heirs who could alter history. But for every child born in triumph, there were countless others lost to silence, miscarriages, stillbirths, or hidden adoptions that altered the course of succession forever. Such moments of vulnerability revealed the fragile balance between human frailty and divine expectation. Whispers persisted of women who guarded secrets no chronicle could record, queens who sheltered illegitimate heirs, arranged false deaths, or concealed unions forbidden by law. Through them, the continuity of sacred blood often survived political catastrophe. Behind revolutions and religious reforms, they acted as living vaults of memory, preserving what could not be written. Their survival instincts became the last refuge of monarchy in times when thrones crumbled like old stone. Even in decline, their influence continued. In exile, royal women maintained networks across borders, their letters forming invisible threads between scattered courts. Their correspondence carried intelligence, arranged marriages, and coordinated survival strategies long after their crowns had been confiscated. Across Europe's upheavals, these matriarchs kept alive the last embers of hereditary order, preparing their descendants to reclaim what history had stolen. Their legacy endures quietly in the lineage of modern royalty, where queens and princesses continue to navigate the delicate dance between tradition and transformation. Through them, the past still whispers, reminding the world that while kings may have ruled, it was often women who decided how, and for how long, dynasties endured. As the 20th century unfolded, royal blood found itself unmoored from the crowns it once wore. Empires collapsed under the weight of wars, revolutions redrew borders, and monarchs who once commanded legions became exiles in foreign lands. Yet, the descendants of Europe's ancient houses adapted with the same resilience that had preserved them through centuries of upheaval. Their titles might have faded, but their names retained a gravity that even republics could not ignore. Power had become symbolic, but symbolism remained power. Scattered across continents, former kings, queens, and their heirs reinvented themselves as diplomats, writers, and philanthropists. Deprived of authority, they became interpreters of heritage, carrying the weight of history into modernity. Their presence in international events, charity foundations, and cultural institutions lent a sense of continuity to a rapidly changing world. Even stripped of scepters, they were still regarded as living relics of an older order, reminders that civilization's lineage was not easily erased. The fascination with royal blood endured precisely because of its transformation. In a world that worshipped democracy, people still gathered to watch royal weddings, coronations, and funerals broadcast across continents. Crowns had lost their legislative meaning, but gained a mythic one. The idea of monarchy had shifted from governance to narrative. Royalty became a story the public continued to tell itself about beauty, grace, and the endurance of identity. Behind this spectacle, the hidden politics of lineage persisted. Old families continued to marry strategically, not for land, but for influence and legacy. Aristocratic circles maintained their own hierarchies, with genealogical purity still regarded as currency. Even those who lived as private citizens often possessed connections that reached deep into international diplomacy and finance. The invisible monarchy of heritage thrived beneath the surface of modern politics, its influence subtle but tangible. Some royal descendants chose anonymity, blending into ordinary society, their lineage known only to a few. Others embraced the weight of their ancestry, becoming ambassadors of culture and continuity. They represented not nations but ideals, discipline, refinement, endurance. Through them, monarchy ceased to be an institution and became an ethos, a living reminder that power, when stripped of armies, still carries resonance when embodied in tradition. Modern Europe, despite its secularism, remains drawn to its royal past. Castles have become museums, but they continue to attract pilgrims of history. Ceremonies once performed for divine blessing are now repeated for memory's sake, their gestures echoing the ancient belief that bloodlines carry more than biology, they carry meaning. Even in republics, fascination with genealogy persists, as though every nation seeks its own mythic origin. In quiet gatherings, descendants of royal houses still meet, maintaining unspoken pacts of kinship that reach across languages and borders. They exchange heirlooms and archives, ensuring that family trees remain intact. Though their names rarely appear in politics, their connections subtly influence decisions of art, diplomacy, and philanthropy. The modern world, believing itself free of monarchy, still dances to rhythms set by those who once ruled. Through these heirs without crowns, Europe remembers itself. Each carries within them a fragment of its ancient architecture, its myths, its wars, its sanctified blood. They are the living memory of what once was, a bridge between centuries, walking reminders that even in an age of equality, heritage still commands its own quiet authority. As centuries pass and empires dissolve into memory, one truth persists: power never vanishes. It merely changes its form. The royal bloodlines of Europe, shaped by conquest and faith, by love and deceit, have woven themselves into the very fabric of the modern world. Their descendants walk through cities that once belonged to their ancestors, unnoticed but not disconnected. Though crowns have tarnished and thrones turned to relics, the pulse of heritage continues, steady and undiminished. Across generations, that pulse has shifted from the visible to the invisible, from scepters to signatures, from coronations to quiet rituals of remembrance. In libraries and estates, in private archives and whispered family gatherings, the stories of ancestry continue to be told. Each retelling keeps alive the belief that identity is not confined to history. It flows through time, binding the living to the forgotten. The idea of divine blood has become metaphor, but the longing behind it endures. Humanity still seeks continuity, still yearns for symbols of permanence in an age that erases itself with every innovation. Monarchs once stood as living embodiments of that permanence. Their descendants now serve as reminders that even in a world governed by reason, mystery remains essential. Their existence, humble or exalted, connects modern life to the timeless rhythm of inheritance. When a crown gleams beneath electric lights or a royal procession winds through a capital, it is more than ceremony, it is ritual memory. The audience may not believe in divine right, but they respond to the ancient language of lineage. They feel the echo of countless generations who once looked upon their rulers and saw reflections of their gods, their ancestors, their own potential for greatness. In this shared recognition, monarchy continues not as governance, but as myth reborn in modern form. Across the continents, from the palaces of Europe to the quiet manors tucked behind city walls, the bloodlines endure not because they cling to the past, but because they embody humanity's oldest dream, to be part of something that never dies. Whether as kings, scholars, or anonymous citizens, those who carry this heritage sustain an unbroken dialogue between memory and future. Their story is less about rule than about remembrance. Through them, history achieves what alchemists once promised, to transform mortality into permanence. The names may change, the symbols evolve, but the essence remains. Power, distilled into tradition, moves silently from generation to generation, whispering of duty, sacrifice, and belonging. Those who inherit it become custodians not of wealth or title, but of memory itself. Europe's bloodlines have become humanity's mirror, reflecting both its triumphs and its vanities. They remind us that civilization is a tapestry woven not only from victories, but from the endurance of stories, from the unbroken faith that meaning can outlive mortality. Through these unseen heirs, the pulse of history continues, carrying forward a single, enduring truth, that the blood of kings, real or imagined, flows still, not through palaces or crowns, but through the collective soul of humankind. Night settles gently across the old continent once more. Cities hum with light, where once stood torch-lit palaces, and rivers reflect the same stars that shone over ancient kings. The voices of history grow faint, but their echoes still drift between cathedral towers and mountain peaks, between cobbled streets and marble halls where the ghosts of monarchs walk unseen. Europe may speak the language of progress now, but beneath its modern rhythm lies the heartbeat of memory, a pulse that has never ceased since crowns first gleamed beneath the sun. Wind passes through ruined castles as though breathing life into their stones, carrying with it whispers of forgotten vows. The names of kings and queens, long erased from documents, hover in the air like half-remembered prayers. Those who listen closely can almost hear them, the soft murmur of dynasties that refused to die, of lines that learned to survive through transformation rather than conquest. Each generation inherits not only its world, but its myth, and those myths, shaped by time and belief, continue to define us even when we think we've outgrown them. In quiet rooms across Europe, families still keep records of ancestors who once stood at the edge of legend. They may no longer wear crowns, but they carry the same sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. The old symbols, lions, lilies, eagles, crosses, still appear carved into doorways and stitched into banners, remnants of an age when heritage was considered sacred. The candle of memory burns low but steady, its light reflected in every ritual that honors continuity, every song that remembers what power once meant. Humanity has always sought immortality, not through endless life, but through remembrance. That is the secret the royal bloodlines discovered and guarded, the understanding that stories can outlast empires, that memory can survive the fall of every wall. Kings and queens may have perished, but their essence endures in the tales we tell, in the symbols we still revere, and in the timeless fascination we hold for those who once ruled through mystery as much as might. Every coronation, every ancient ritual, every family crest carved into stone was an attempt to say one thing: that existence is not fleeting, that we belong to a chain unbroken by death or distance. Today, the crowns may rest behind glass, and the thrones may stand empty, but their meaning lingers. We still gather to watch royal weddings, we still trace genealogies, we still whisper about hidden heirs. It is not nostalgia, it is the desire to see ourselves in the story of continuity, to find within history's shadows a reflection of our own search for significance. So as the candle burns lower, its flame trembling but unextinguished, remember what these stories have shown: that power can fade, but legacy never truly vanishes. Bloodlines may blend and nations may change, but the essence that once bound king to subject, dream to destiny, remains part of the human spirit. Every name, every symbol, every echo of ancestry carries forward the same light that first flickered in Europe's forgotten halls. The night is quiet now, the chronicles closed, but the glow persists, a small flame in the heart of memory, reminding us that while time erases crowns, it cannot extinguish the yearning to remember where we came from. The candle still burns, steady and eternal, casting its light across the ruins and the living alike. If you have journeyed through these stories and felt their quiet pull, keep that flame alive. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the hidden echoes of history. Like this film, if its stories moved you, share your thoughts below in the comments, and pass this tale to those you love so that they too may listen to the whispers of forgotten crowns and keep the candle burning.